Auschwitz was the camp with the highest number of victims in the entire Nazi network. It operated from 1940 until 1945 as both an extermination complex and a forced labor center. It was built in the occupied territory of Poland, with 3 main camps and more than 40 subcamps. Prisoners arrived in cattle trains after several days of travel without water or food. Upon arrival, they were separated on ramps by SS doctors who decided who would live and who would die. Millions were sent directly to the gas chambers without being registered. Others were assigned to slave labor, systematic torture, or used in medical experiments. The bodies were cremated or buried in pits. Before the end, the Nazis destroyed records and burned evidence. Even so, documents, testimonies, ruins, human remains, and direct accounts survived, revealing how the most lethal extermination machine of the Third Reich operated. How did Auschwitz become a perfect daily machine of torture? Arrival to hell, selection, deception, and initial dehumanization. The trains arrived at night, with sealed doors and overcrowded wagons. Inside, men, women, and children traveled for hours without water, without space, without air. Some stood, others collapsed on the floor. When the doors opened, the cold air rushed in along with the screams. Soldiers ordered everyone to disembark quickly. No one knew where they were or what was happening. The ramp was lit with floodlights. On each side stood guards, dogs, and uniformed officers. A loudspeaker repeated that there was no reason to be afraid, that it was merely a routine procedure. The newcomers were guided into separate lines while they were asked to leave their luggage on the ground. They were promised it would be returned to them later. In a matter of minutes, the selection began. S officers, accompanied by doctors, observed each person as they passed. With a simple hand gesture, they sent some to the left and others to the right. No explanations were given. Some were separated from their children, others from their parents. No one knew why. Most thought it was something temporary. Those who appeared fit to work were led down one path. The rest, mainly the elderly, women with children, or sick individuals, were quietly taken aside. That group was told they would shower before eating and resting. They were led into a sealed building, where they were handed soap and a towel, and were asked to hang their clothes carefully. They were assured they would find them upon leaving. Inside, the room had shower heads on the ceiling. Once everyone was inside, the door was forcefully closed from the outside. Shortly afterward, the gas was released. Those who were selected to live were taken to another section. There, they were ordered to undress completely, without privacy or pause. The clothing was collected in piles, without labels or names. Then they were forced to pass through a line of prisoners tasked with shaving them. All body hair was removed with dull blades. There was no soap or hot water. Afterward, they were sprayed with a disinfectant substance, while others watched over them. In the next room, a number was tattooed on their left arm. From that moment on, the person's name disappeared. They were no longer called by their identity, but by the number engraved on their skin. No one could refuse. No one was given an explanation. Then they were handed used clothing, often dirty, torn, or far too large. No distinction was made for size or condition. The shoes didn't match. Some received only one shoe or pieces of cloth tied to their feet. The transformation was complete. No trace remained of the person who had arrived at the camp. Many tried to ask about their relatives. The children who had disembarked from the train were gone. The women did not return. No answers came. There were only orders, shoves, and silence. After that process, the prisoners were guided to a barrack with wooden bunks, without mattresses, without clean blankets, without warmth. There they spent their first night, crammed among strangers. The air was damp, the atmosphere thick, and the sound of footsteps never ceased. Some cried silently, others said nothing. The first day ended without having understood anything. The first to shout at dawn was a guard. Everyone had to get out quickly, form lines without mistakes, move without questions. Thus began life in Auschwitz. Everything was designed to disorient, divide, and break. Control was achieved through deception, precision, and speed. The goal was to eliminate the will from the very first minute. Hunger, cold, and labor as a form of slow extermination. Every morning began with the same sound, a sharp shout, an urgent order, footsteps running over frozen ground. Bodies emerged from the wooden bunks, weak, clumsy, with no warmth in their muscles. For some, the day had already begun much earlier, especially for those who hadn't slept due to their bodies trembling. Blankets did not exist. The windows had no glass. The wind entered through the cracks in the walls and did not leave. Prisoners were given a hot, dark drink called coffee. In reality, it had no coffee. It was dirty water with a bitter taste. It was consumed standing, in groups, with no personal container. Each person received what could fit in a bowl, which was passed between frozen hands. That was the first meal of the day. After the hot liquid came roll call, everyone standing without moving, without speaking, without knowing how long it would last. Sometimes an hour, sometimes 3. During that time, feet stuck to the ground, the cold climbed up the ankles and teeth kept chattering. The coat consisted of a piece of cloth. The striped uniform had no lining, no layer, no protection. The shoes were blocks of wood held together with strips of old fabric. If there was snow, it went straight to the foot. If it rained, the body was soaked. After roll call came the march. Hundreds walked toward work sites. Some left the camp, others went to construction sites within the perimeter. The journey could last more than an hour. The pace was mandatory. Whoever fell had no time to get up. The group did not stop. Those at the back dragged the fallen. The ground was mud, stone, puddle, or ice. It didn't matter. The labor was physical, without modern tools, without breaks, without food along the way. Digging trenches, carrying stones, dragging carts. Some were assigned to senseless, repetitive tasks, such as moving a pile of sand from one place to another and then returning it. It was part of the system. The goal was not to produce, but to exhaust. Those who tried to avoid effort were singled out. A supervisor could shout, hit, or withhold the day's ration. At midday, the prisoners received a container with liquid. They called it soup. It contained hot water with cabbage, sometimes with potato peel or pieces of carrot floating in it. Occasionally, there was a strand of animal fat. Most of the time, it had no salt or consistency. Some didn't manage to receive it if the work lasted too long. The body felt the emptiness. The stomach contracted. The trembling did not stop, not even with the heat of the soup. The labor continued until nightfall. Sunlight was no guide, but hunger was the clock. On the way back to the camp, the pace slowed. Legs ached. The air grew colder. Upon arrival, another line, another roll call, more time standing. Some no longer responded. They had to be shaken. Those who didn't move were carried or left on the ground. No one asked. Dinner consisted of a slice of bread, sometimes a spoonful of margarine. On specific days, a grey mixture of cooked flour. The bread was compact, hard, rationed by weight. Each piece had to be enough for several people. Some cut it with the edge of a rusty sheet of metal. The lucky ones received a portion without mould. During the night, bodies piled together for warmth, 3, 4, or 5 people per bunk. There were no blankets. The wet uniform dried against the skin. Body vapour formed frost on the walls. Breathing was difficult. Sleeping was not possible for everyone. Some woke with cramps, others with blood on their gums. Some simply didn't wake up. Weight loss was constant. Each week the body grew more fragile, ribs protruded, knees trembled when standing, eyelids hurt, wounds wouldn't heal, gums bled, hair fell out, fingers lost colour. No one talked about it. People just walked. The cold increased with the months. Winter was a sentence. The barracks had no heating. The windows were broken. Wind blew from one side to the other. Hands cracked, feet swelled, ears lost sensation. Some pulled off their own nails to relieve pressure. The shoes never dried. Socks didn't exist. Those who showed signs of weakness were watched. If someone fell during work, they were struck. If they were slow to rise, another blow. If they remained still, no soup. If they insisted on falling, they disappeared from roll call. No announcement was needed, just one less figure in line. Hunger was not a flaw in the system. It was part of the design. Rations were calculated to keep the body on the edge of collapse, just enough to keep walking, the minimum to avoid immediate death. The limit was intentional. Every calorie was counted. Every spoonful was measured. Those who tried to save part of their bread were punished. Hiding food was considered theft. Bread was controlled by the kapos. Some traded portions. A bite of bread could cost an extra hour of labor. A sip of soup was exchanged for a piece of coat. The weakening was progressive. Legs no longer responded. The stomach ached even when empty. The body stiffened while walking. Hands couldn't form a fist. The back hunched. The neck drooped. Colour vanished from the face. Skin clung to bone. Breathing became an effort. Those who could no longer hold a shovel were assigned simpler tasks: sweeping, carrying light objects, cleaning dirty areas. That change wasn't a reward. It was the step before being excluded from the work group. Being left out meant not receiving rations, dying inside while sitting. Some searched for food in the trash. Others stole peels from the ground. Some collected insects. Anything that could be chewed was eaten. Some drank stagnant water. Others sucked on snow. No one shared anything. Hunger did not allow gestures. Bodies became silhouettes. It was impossible to tell exact ages. Everyone looked old. Everyone trembled while walking. Everyone stared at the ground. Strength became invisible. The body continued out of routine, fear, habit. No muscle responded to will, only to fear. On the coldest days, the entire camp moved slower. Lines grew longer, the fallen more frequent. Punishments came quicker. No one was allowed to stop working because of the weather. Snow covered the shoes. Sweat froze on the skin. The labor wasn't meant to build anything useful. It was meant to destroy from within. Day after day, the capacity to think, to react, to speak diminished. The body became a worn-out tool. The goal wasn't productivity, it was controlled deterioration. Beatings as daily routine. Inside the camp, beatings were not exceptions, nor were they warnings. They were part of the daily soundscape, like whistles or shouted orders at dawn. Beatings required no clear reason. It was enough to be in the wrong place, turn one's head, or not react quickly enough. Any gesture could become a signal for attack. Those responsible for delivering them were the capos, prisoners with authority over others. Some wore colored armbands. Others imposed respect with their tone or their stare. Many carried thick clubs, made of wood, metal, or hardened rubber. Some used old electrical cables, tool handles, or sticks taken from the barracks. Hands also sufficed. Upon arrival at the camp, a blow marked the beginning. It didn't matter if someone was new. One didn't need to speak the language. The body quickly learned which movements caused pain. Newcomers received a beating just for walking slowly, looking at a guard, standing still, or asking questions. The message was immediate: move in a straight line, quickly and silently. Every lineup, every formation, every transfer carried with it the possibility of a beating. No instructions were given beforehand. Mistakes were not corrected with words, only with impact. Punishment was not applied based on the severity of the act, but on the availability of punishment. It was always within reach. There was always something to hit with. In the barracks, beatings were part of control. The capo slept separately. He had his own bed, coat, and privileges. If someone snored, sneezed, or spoke loudly, the punishment could come immediately. A stick to the ribs, a shove with a boot, or an open-handed slap. No one intervened. Silence was the rule. During morning formation, beatings were public. Whoever stepped out of line, spoke, wobbled, or turned their head was dragged to the front. There, in front of everyone, they were beaten. Sometimes 5 blows sufficed. Other times it was 15 or 20. The number was not fixed. The rhythm was set by the mood of the aggressor. Some counted aloud. Others struck in silence. The tools varied. Wooden clubs were the most common. Straps were also used. Whips improvised from braided belts, rifle butts, or even metal boxes. Some capos preferred to use their fists. Others used their knee, elbow, or boot. They struck the back, ribs, legs, head, wherever the blow landed. At times, beatings were part of collective punishment. If a group did not work quickly enough, all were forced to form a circle. One by one, they stepped into the center. The capo beat them with the same object without pause. Then came the next one's turn. The punishment could last an entire hour. No one emerged unscathed. Beatings were also carried out in the work area. Anyone who stopped for a second, dropped a tool, or asked for water was dragged to a corner. There, the group supervisor used whatever was at hand. Sometimes an iron bar, other times a shovel. The blow didn't end with the sound. It continued with humiliation. The punished person was forced to get up and continue working, bleeding, or limping. If someone collapsed from exhaustion, the blow was automatic. First a shout, then a kick to the back or the head. If they didn't get up, 2 capos dragged them out of the line and kicked them until they stood. If they couldn't, they were left lying there. The punishment had already been dealt. Inside the blocks, beatings required no witnesses. If a prisoner was accused of stealing bread, speaking with someone from the outside, or hiding something, they were locked in a corner. The capo beat them alone, without witnesses, without a time limit. Sometimes it lasted half an hour, sometimes until he was tired. On inspection days, beatings increased. Everything had to be clean, aligned, orderly. If a bed was not perfectly aligned, if a garment didn't hang straight, the blow came without warning. Sometimes with a baton, other times with a plank, a metal object, or a broomstick. Anything served to strike. Some beatings had names. The punishment of 100 was a sequence of 100 blows with a stick, applied rhythmically to the same part of the body, sometimes to the back, other times to the thighs or the soles of the feet. The prisoner had to count out loud. If they made a mistake in the number, it started over. Some fainted during the attempt. If they fell to the ground, water was thrown on them so it could continue. Other punishments consisted of squatting and standing up hundreds of times, receiving a blow if it wasn't done at the expected pace. The guards believed the body had to respond without hesitation. Delay was a lack of discipline, a slow reaction, disobedience. A cry was not a sign of pain, it was a sign of weakness. Those who screamed received more blows. The punishments served as a spectacle. Prisoners were placed in the middle of the square. Everyone was ordered to form a circle. The one who had committed an infraction was brought to the center. There, in front of hundreds of people, they received the beating. Some were left unconscious, others crawled back. No one could look away. The punishment was also psychological. The frequency didn't decrease over time. Over the years, the routine of beatings became part of the camp's structure. Physical punishment was as common as bread. New arrivals learned it on the first day. The older ones no longer felt it. The body developed a resistance to the blow, but not to the fear. Weather made no difference. Whether it rained, snowed, or was hot, the blows came just the same. If a prisoner slipped on ice, they received a blow for clumsiness. If they bled from an unhealed wound, another for making a mess. If they walked slowly from exhaustion, another still. Everything was punished. Body language changed. No one turned their head. No one responded to a shove. No one protested. Everyone knew that any word could be a trigger. Eyes on the ground, arms tight to the body, quick steps. Everything was defense. Blows were also used as a warning. A capo could hit one person to control 20. The assaulted individual didn't need to have done anything. They simply served as an example. Someone else's pain acted as a deterrent for the rest. Obedience was born from fear. The weakest prisoners were easy targets, the sick, the elderly, the thinnest. They were beaten more frequently. The capos knew they wouldn't protest. They also took it out on the newcomers. Beating a new arrival served to establish authority. Some capos turned beatings into a daily routine. They had schedules. They beat after roll call or upon returning from work. They did it as part of their role. Some enjoyed it. Others saw it as necessary. All enforced it. The SS guards also took part. If they saw someone move out of place, they pushed them to the ground with a rifle. If they spoke among themselves, they struck with the butt. If they laughed, they kicked with a boot. There was no prior warning. Prisoners learned to anticipate by observing the capo's gestures. They knew when a blow was coming. Some tried to shield themselves. Others simply gave in. The body reacted before the mind. Mengele and the science of medical cruelty. In a secluded ward within the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex, there stood a low building surrounded by wire. It was there that Josef Mengele operated. He wore a pristine uniform, polished boots, and walked among patients as if he were running a clinic. But he did not heal. He ordered incisions, tests, and surgeries without anesthesia. His interest lay elsewhere. Twins were his obsession. In each newly arrived convoy, identical pairs were sought out. If two children had similar features, they were separated from the general group. They were not sent to the gas chambers or to forced labor. They were taken to the experimentation block. They were given clothes, mattresses, rations. Some thought they had been lucky. The opposite was true. Each pair received a number. Their measurements, eye color, height, and skull shape were recorded. Then the tests began. First, repeated blood analyses. Then, unknown injections. Some developed fevers, rashes, convulsions. The doctors observed. They recorded reactions. If one became ill, the other received the same substance. The goal was to verify biological symmetries. When one died, the other was executed. The interest then shifted to the autopsy. Organs were examined, tissues compared. The results were stored in files. No family received an explanation. No body was returned. In another section, bodies were opened while still alive. Abdominal incisions were made without any kind of sedation. Prisoners were strapped to the table with belts. Their arms and legs were restrained. Sections of intestine were removed, fragments of liver, parts of the lungs. The only preparation was an injection to prevent spasms. The pain was absolute. Some screamed until they lost their voice. Others fainted during the procedure. When breathing became irregular, the assistants observed the response. If the subject stopped moving, Mengele ordered the body to be closed and sent to cremation. If they survived, they were returned to the barrack for recovery. A few days later, they were brought back for a second procedure. There were prisoners who underwent 3 or 4 operations. The wounds did not heal. They became infected. No bandages or antibiotics were used, only damp rags or newspaper. The body weakened and served as a demonstration of degeneration. That was also part of the experiment. Women were subjected to sterilization tests. Substances were injected into the uterus using improvised syringes. At times, direct radiation was applied to the abdomen. Some lost mobility. Others suffered from constant hemorrhaging. Many had their ovaries removed. Some had their fallopian tubes sealed with hot chemicals. After the procedure, patients were ordered to remain in bed. They were not given painkillers, nor water. If any of them complained, they were injected to put them to sleep. If they woke up screaming, they were gagged. Most did not survive more than 2 weeks. Children were also targets of the experiments. Newborns were taken and injected with bacteria directly into the spinal cord. Others were subjected to cross-transfusions between different blood groups. Many suffered collapses. Some lost the ability to speak. Others stopped walking. Symptoms were recorded on charts. The language used was technical, but the goal was to observe the damage. In another section of the laboratory, amputations were performed. Arms, legs, sections of rib were removed, not for healing, but to measure bleeding time, muscle contraction, or the nervous system's response capacity. Some amputations were performed partially and then repeated. Certain prisoners had fragments of glass, wood, or metal implanted under their skin. The purpose was to observe infections. If the body reacted with fever or pus, it was noted as data. If the body did not react, the fragment size was increased. Lethal injections were part of the protocol. They were not administered solely for elimination. They were used to test combinations. Chemicals, animal hormones, industrial waste were mixed. The substance was injected into the heart or neck. Sometimes the subject died within seconds. Sometimes minutes of convulsions would pass. Before dying, blood, saliva, or fluids were extracted. Then the body was opened. The organs were examined without delay. Autopsies were as quick as executions. Efficiency was sought. Every piece of data went into the medical block's files. Many of the assistants were forced prisoners. One of them, Miklos Nisli, a Hungarian doctor, performed duties under threat of death. He assisted in dissections, prepared reports. He could not refuse. For months he witnessed surgeries, deaths and tests without clinical rationale, only statistics to justify a racial theory. Some experiments involved inducing diseases. Viruses, bacteria, fungi were inoculated. Sometimes typhus, tuberculosis or malaria cultures were introduced. Then the progression was observed. If the subject survived, another variant was injected. If they died, the exact time was recorded. Eyes were a frequent object of interest. Methods were sought to alter the color of the iris. Dyes were applied, pigments injected. The eye was exposed to direct light for hours. Some prisoners went blind. Others suffered irreversible corneal damage. In another area, holes were drilled into the skull. Part of the bone was removed to insert electrodes or improvised probes. The goal was to observe brain activity. Sometimes controlled blows were applied to induce damage. Then the body's reaction time was measured. Many did not survive the procedure. Others were left in a vegetative state. The bodies were piled in the laboratory morgue. Those deemed scientifically valuable were preserved in alcohol. Skulls, hearts, lungs were stored. Some were sent to German institutes. Others served for further comparisons. The entire process was documented. Each subject had a file with a number, origin, physical condition, and reactions to the tests. The conclusions were presented in reports that circulated within the Nazi medical apparatus. They spoke of discoveries, of progress, but it was all based on suffering. Pregnant women were forced to abort, sometimes through chemical methods, other times by direct extraction. If the fetus survived, it was examined in the laboratory. If not, it was discarded. There were no protocols, only orders, and each order ended in a new test. Some subjects had their lungs punctured with hollow needles. Air was withdrawn, then gas or liquids were injected. The goal was to induce edema. If the prisoner coughed blood, it was considered useful data. If they died instantly, the next subject was taken. At times, the experiments were repeated with minimal variations. The same substance was injected into the left arm instead of the right, or the dosage was increased. If the result was similar, it was filed. If different, a new test line was initiated. Everything was designed to maintain a steady flow of bodies. When the useful subjects ran out, more were requested. The process was automatic. Transports brought new twins, new sick, new forced volunteers. No block remained empty. The days in the laboratory began early. Mengele arrived smiling. He reviewed the lists, gave instructions. He walked among beds, inspected wounds, asked for results. He showed no haste, nor anger. His tone was neutral, his decisions firm. Sometimes he attended the operations, other times he merely observed. But every order went through him. His signature was on every plan, every death. He left no loose ends. Every result bore his initials, every corpse his approval. Industrial asphyxiation, gas chambers, and the death factory. Each day began with a list. The transport headed to the extermination sector carried between 1,000 and 3,000 people. Upon arrival, the selectors indicated the direction. Most walked toward the block where the gas chambers operated. No one knew what happened inside until they crossed the door. The buildings had the appearance of communal bath facilities. Outside, signs indicated showers. Inside, the space was divided into several zones, a room for undressing, another for apparent medical inspections, and a main area with a low ceiling, concrete walls, and airtight doors. The ceiling included metal openings sealed from the outside. That was where the gas entered. The product used was Zyklon B. These were compact crystals that released hydrogen cyanide upon contact with air. The containers were handled by technical staff. Upon arrival, the chamber lid was opened from the outside. The contents were poured in, and the opening was closed immediately. The effect was almost instantaneous. The victims inhaled the gas without realizing it. Within seconds, spasms began. Some fell to the floor. Others piled up against the door, trying to breathe through the lower gap. The duration of the process depended on several factors: number of people, temperature, ventilation. On average, death occurred between 4 and 20 minutes. The screams ceased within the first 5. Then came silence. The next group to act were the Sonderkommando. They were prisoners selected to operate the extermination machinery. Their task began as soon as the gas dissipated. The metal door was opened and the air escaped. The first impact was the smell. Then came the scene. Naked bodies piled up, with signs of asphyxiation, blood from the nose, foam at the mouth, eyes left open. The Sonderkommando entered with gloves and heavy boots. They had to clear the space within minutes. The bodies were dragged onto metal carts. Some were too heavy due to rigor mortis. In those cases, hooks or straps were used. Victims with gold teeth were separated. The teeth were extracted with pliers. Women's hair was also cut. Everything was sorted into sacks. Once outside the chamber, the bodies were taken to the ovens. These were located in the same building or in an adjacent annex. Cremations followed a precise sequence. Each oven could receive between 2 and 4 bodies per round. The fire was kept burning all day. Fuel was added only when body fat was insufficient. The incineration time ranged between 20 and 40 minutes per group. The ashes were collected with shovels and deposited into buckets. They were then transported to open fields. There, they were either scattered or emptied into the river. Some were used to fill pathways. The schedules were strict. Several cycles were planned per day. A single building could operate with 3 extermination shifts in one day. When the number of bodies exceeded the capacity of the ovens, open-air pits were used. Long trenches were dug. Bodies were thrown in and covered with fuel. The fire burned for hours. The process produced constant smoke. On some days, the smoke clouded parts of the camp. The smell of burning flesh spread for kilometers. Nearby residents knew the origin, though they pretended not to understand. The gas handlers were trained technicians. They traveled from Berlin to supervise the application. They wore masks, gloves, and special suits. They instructed soldiers on handling Zyklon B. Each shipment was recorded. Each container was accounted for. The product was stored in refrigerated warehouses. Heat accelerated evaporation. For that reason, the barrels were moved at the last moment. Each one contained enough to annihilate 1,000 people. The Sonderkommando could not refuse. They received better food, footwear, blankets. but they knew their fate. Every 3 or 4 months, they were replaced. The former ones were eliminated. They were part of the secret. Some of them kept clandestine notes. They wrote down names, dates, quantities. They hid papers under the ground or between the walls. Part of that information was discovered after the war. It allowed for the reconstruction of part of the process. The chambers were isolated from the rest of the camp. Only designated personnel were allowed to approach. The orders were clear. No one was to witness what occurred inside. Photographs were not permitted. Only a few technical drawings were recovered. Each chamber was designed for maximum efficiency. Forced ventilation allowed for the acceleration of the next cycle. Engines were activated to expel the remaining gases. Then the walls were washed down with hoses. The floor was swept. Stains were concealed. The shifts were synchronized with the arrival of trains. When multiple wagons arrived in a single day, activity multiplied. Sometimes the chambers operated at night. Spotlights were used for illumination. The lines kept moving. No one asked questions. Some survivors saw the columns of smoke. They heard the rumors. They suspected what was happening. But it was never confirmed. The process was hidden behind brick walls and protocols of silence. Engineers designed improvements. Systems were introduced to raise the temperature. Doors were widened. Ceilings reinforced. Mechanisms installed to increase the number of bodies per cycle. The goal was to accelerate the entire process. Smaller bodies, such as those of children, were placed between adults to maximize heat efficiency. Piles were organized by size. The workers knew how to position them to optimize combustion. The language used was technical. They spoke of output, efficiency, volume. Victim lists were destroyed at the end of each day. Only transport records remained. The rest was erased. The figures were round: 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. Names were not counted, only the total. When the chambers became saturated, more were built. Facilities were expanded, new pits dug. The camp adapted to the demand. The wagons arrived without pause. The system did not stop. Workers were rotated in shifts. Each group rested only a few hours. They slept in nearby barracks. Some collapsed, others endured. All knew their time was limited. The smoke blended into the routine. New prisoners asked what it was. Some said it came from factories. Others remained silent. No one said the word. But everyone knew it. On certain dates, the shifts were increased. During mass deportations, the camp operated at full capacity. All the chambers were opened. Zyklon B shipments multiplied. Trains crowded the tracks. The lines moved without pause. The pits filled with remains. They were stirred with mechanical shovels. Layers of lime were thrown in. Then they were burned. New bodies were placed on top. The cycle continued, without pauses. The testimonies are consistent. The process was fast, silent, constant. Interruptions were not allowed. If a chamber malfunctioned, it was repaired immediately. Parts were brought in from other camps. The machinery could not stop. Supervisors took roll. They monitored the amount of gas, number of cycles, cremation time. Everything was measured. Everything was recorded. But nothing was preserved. The archive was destroyed. The walls absorbed the heat and the noise. The ceilings blackened from the smoke. The floor was stained by blood and bodily fluids. Everything was later covered, but the trace remained. Forced prostitution and sexual slavery inside the camp. By the middle of the year 1942, the SS leadership implemented an internal brothel system in several concentration camps, including Auschwitz. These establishments, known as Freudenhäuser, were devised as a tool to incentivize productivity among collaborating prisoners and to reward capos who fulfilled surveillance, labor, or repression objectives. The women selected to be part of these brothels came primarily from Ravensbrück, the camp designated for female prisoners. They were chosen under pressure, with promises of extra food, better conditions, or early release, although none of these promises were kept. The transfer process was presented as voluntary. However, the psychological coercion and abuse of power were so extreme that the women had no real ability to choose. Once at Auschwitz, they were housed in special barracks near the administrative blocks. There, under constant surveillance, they began a mechanical and forced routine. Each night, they were forced to have relations with prisoners selected by the SS on strict schedules, with limited time and complete control. The infrastructure of these brothels was designed to simulate respect and hygiene, with individual beds, sheets, lighting, and running water. This decor contrasted with the daily brutality experienced by the women forced to participate. The sessions were supervised, timed and recorded. No emotional bond or prolonged conversation was permitted. The woman was simply a body under regime. The men chosen to access these services were capos, privileged prisoners, or specialized workers who collaborated with the camp administration. They paid with coupons distributed by the SS. Those who did not perform useful functions were excluded. Visits lasted 10 to 15 minutes and could be repeated if the prisoner was considered efficient by the supervisors. The reward served as a prize for obedience. Sex was instrumentalized to reinforce internal hierarchies. The women, by contrast, received no real compensation. Their food remained scarce, their mobility restricted, and their health quickly deteriorated. Many contracted venereal diseases, suffered constant bleeding, or fell into deep depressive states. Those who resisted were punished, sent back to common blocks, or assigned to forced labor until exhaustion. The brothel operated as a chain of exploitation masked by Nazi rhetoric of order and efficiency. Camp doctors carried out regular checkups on the prisoners, not to care for their well-being, but to ensure they remained fit to perform their role. Injections were administered, and experimental treatments applied without consent. Some were sterilized without explanation, others disappeared without a trace. Rotations were frequent. If a woman could not fulfill the expected service, she was replaced without hesitation. The pressure did not only come from the SS. Some prisoners were harassed by fellow inmates who saw them as a source of jealousy, suspicion, or resentment. In a structure where survival depended on small advantages, being in the brothel could be perceived as a privilege, though in reality it was a horrific form of slavery. This ambiguity turned many of them into targets of rumors, accusations, and exclusion, even within the camp's own world. The emotional consequences were devastating. The women lost all control over their bodies. They had no rest, no privacy, no respect. They lived under constant surveillance without emotional contact and under a continual threat of punishment. Many stopped speaking, isolated themselves, or attempted self-harm. Some died from infections, others were executed for disobeying orders or revealing what occurred in the brothels. The relationships that formed followed no pattern of consent. If a prisoner grew attached to a woman, he could be punished. If a woman showed disgust toward a visitor, she was beaten. If an officer became infatuated with a prisoner, he could claim her as property. Consent did not exist. Will was erased. The female body became territory occupied by the regime. In addition to the central brothel at Auschwitz, there were small clandestine spaces where SS officers selected women for their personal use. These prisoners did not appear in official records. They were removed from the labor system, kept in private barracks or secluded areas, and received treatment that depended entirely on the whims of the officer. Sometimes they lasted days, other times weeks. Their ultimate fate was always uncertain. In the case of some young women, sexual coercion did not come with explicit threats, but with offers of protection or food. A guard might promise extra rations in exchange for favors. A capo could offer a blanket in winter in return for submission. The sexual power structure was embedded at every level of the camp. Blackmail, abuse, and domination became common currency. Documentation on this system is scarce, as many surviving victims chose silence. Some feared being judged as collaborators, others wanted to erase that chapter from their memory. Even decades later, speaking about it meant reliving the trauma. Nevertheless, Nazi documents, witness testimonies, and post-war interrogations of officers made it possible to reconstruct part of this sexual slavery network. Nazi authorities justified these brothels as disciplinary and preventive measures. They claimed that regulated access to sexual relations would reduce violence among prisoners and prevent homosexual relationships or disorder. In reality, it was an experiment in total control over the human body, masked as military pragmatism. Sexuality was transformed into an instrument of total domination. The final fate of many women used in the brothels was oblivion. Some died in the camps from illness, others were deported to places where they disappeared without record. Only a small number managed to survive and bear witness. Their voices allow for the reconstruction of one of the most silenced aspects of the Auschwitz system, institutionalized, systematic, and structural sexual violence. Exemplary punishments, hangings, shootings, and mutilations. Exemplary punishment was an essential piece in the repressive machinery of Auschwitz. It was not about sanctioning offenses, but about turning each punitive act into a direct warning. The camp operated under a logic of deterrence. Death was used as a message, as a tool to break individual thought. Each public execution was designed to provoke fear, submission, and obedience. In the inner yard of the main camp, a wooden structure stood. There, in front of hundreds of prisoners lined up in silence, the hangings were carried out. There was no room for appeal. The sentence was executed with a repeated routine. The prisoner, surrounded by members of the SS, would ascend the platform. Sometimes he was allowed to speak. Other times a capo would snatch off his cap before placing the noose. The executioner would tighten the knot and the trapdoor would open. The body remained suspended until it was motionless. Silence was mandatory. The slightest murmur could become grounds for suspicion or retaliation. These hangings were usually applied for infractions such as attempting to escape, stealing food, or making forbidden contact. The punishment went beyond the individual. The instruction was clear: everyone had to watch. If someone disobeyed, the SS would repeat the scene with another prisoner. The spectacle aimed to instill emotional paralysis. Public death not only eliminated the condemned, but transformed the spectator into a hostage of their own fear. Sometimes the victim was a young man accused of conspiring, other times an elderly man who had picked up potatoes from the garbage. Execution made no distinction between age or health. The rule was to erase will. No explanation was required, only obedience. Shootings followed a different logic. They were generally carried out of sight of the common prisoners. In the early years of the camp, a concrete wall known as the Black Wall was used. In front of it, under strict surveillance, the prisoners were lined up. The order came from the camp commander or a block leader. Once ready, the officers fired at close range. The bodies fell in a line and other prisoners were forced to remove them. On several occasions, entire groups were executed on charges of sabotage or rebellion. There was no trial or defense. The process was direct: selection, transfer, death. The impact was not limited to those present. The news spread quickly among the barracks. A single signal could provoke collective collapse. The strategy of collective terror was constant. Mutilations as punishment were applied less frequently, but they had a specific purpose: to physically destroy without killing. Prisoners who attempted to escape and were recaptured were forced to endure amputations without anesthesia or with rudimentary tools. Some lost fingers, others were branded with hot irons. In extreme cases, bones were intentionally broken. These actions aimed to nullify any future attempt at disobedience. Physical punishment was also applied to those who failed to complete tasks. Sometimes ears were pierced, faces disfigured, or genitals burned. The logic was the same: to prevent a return to normalcy, to transform the body into evidence of punishment. The participation of the capos was crucial. They executed direct orders from the officers. At times, they were authorized to decide the punishment. If someone failed to clean the barrack, the capo could order a severe beating followed by an amputation. In other situations, the SS reserved the final decision. A common variant was execution by suspension. The prisoner was hung by the wrists, tied behind the back, with the body suspended from the ground for hours. This method caused dislocations, broken shoulders, and loss of consciousness. It was used either as torture prior to execution or as a full punishment. Witnesses knew that anyone taken to that structure returned in a terminal state or did not return at all. There was also the system of collective punishment. If a prisoner escaped and was not recaptured, the guards executed 10 people from the same block. In these cases, selection was random. The group was lined up, the bodies counted, and aim taken with precision. Sometimes execution was by firing squad, other times by confinement in unventilated cells until death by suffocation. Internal reports recorded these punishments as necessary disciplinary actions. Administrative language concealed the brutality of the system. What occurred in those executions was not justice. It was a message. Each execution marked the camp as a space of no return. Behavior was not judged. Existences were nullified. The space chosen for hangings varied. Sometimes the yard was used, at other times the area outside the crematorium. When executions coincided with official inspections, they were either accelerated or postponed. On symbolic dates, such as Hitler's anniversaries, the number of deaths increased. Punishment adapted to the logic of political terror. Some prisoners were forced to dig their own graves before being executed. The act served to extend the suffering. Digging under threat, with an exhausted body, while listening to the guards' taunts, became another part of the procedure. Upon completion, the shot was fired at point-blank range. Then the grave was sealed without ceremony. In the case of women, executions followed a similar pattern, but with an added layer of humiliation. Some were stripped naked before being shot. On other occasions, female prisoners were forced to witness the murder of their companions. The visual punishment acted as reinforcement of the physical punishment. The psychological effect was devastating. Many prisoners suffered mental breakdowns after witnessing these acts. The sense of inevitability, the constant fear, and the inability to protect others created an internal rupture. This emotional fracture was part of the system. The camp did not only punish with blood, it also shattered the mind. The Sonderkommando in charge of moving bodies after executions had to act quickly. Any error in the process could lead to immediate execution. The corpses were removed, stacked, and registered in minimal lists. There were no burials, only procedures. The bodies became data. Every corner of Auschwitz was prepared for killing or punishing. Over time, the methods were refined. Executions were scheduled more efficiently. Techniques were combined, locations rotated, new devices used. What began as occasional punishment became a routine function. Punishment became part of the landscape of the camp. Psychological torture, symbolic humiliation, and the destruction of will. In Auschwitz, violence was not limited to beatings or killings. The apparatus of terror also extended into the invisible realm of the mind. From the very first day, the SS deployed an arsenal of strategies to break each prisoner's will, stripping them not only of their body, but also of their emotional resistance. Rules changed without warning, punishments arrived without cause, and any gesture could become a trigger. The camp was designed to slowly destroy the identity of anyone who entered. Each day began with shouted orders, with no room for error. Formations lasted for hours, under rain or snow, only to count and recount already dead bodies. Logic didn't matter. The goal was to impose absurdity as law. Those who tried to find meaning ended up broken. Forced silence, demanded rigidity, and choreographed movements under threat created an environment where no one could think independently. Time lost coherence. Space no longer offered refuge. The SS used sarcasm as a tool of control. They asked dying prisoners if they were comfortable or offered ironic applause to those who collapsed from the cold. Sometimes they forced prisoners to sing songs while marching with corpses on their shoulders. On other occasions, they made them compete in absurd challenges like lifting useless stones or sweeping a mud-covered yard with broken brooms. There was no goal beyond ridiculing the individual in front of others. That fake laughter functioned as a weapon. Throughout the barracks, humiliation was part of the routine. Some guards forced inmates to imitate animals, bark like dogs, walk on all fours, or sway while reciting German patriotic hymns. Others ordered them to kiss their muddy boots, or demanded thanks for being alive while witnessing a firing squad. In the hospitals, nurses subjected terminal patients to open mockery, promising care that never came, just to see how they clung to a false hope. Emotional breakdown was also induced through internal dynamics. The capo system, inmates with delegated power, created a structure where trust was impossible. Friends of many years could denounce each other for an extra ration. Someone who shared bread one day could become the executioner the next. Solidarity was punished. Helping a comrade walk was seen as an obstacle to production. Suspicion was constant. Every gesture was analyzed. Every silence was heavy. Paranoia became law. Some were ordered to stand before entire rows and confess to crimes they hadn't committed. They were made to repeat their offenses until they broke down in tears. Others were forced to look into the eyes of those who would be executed because of them. The camp did not kill only with bullets or gas. It also killed with shame, with helplessness, with manufactured guilt. Emotions were tools of torture. Language was manipulated as a weapon. The SS spoke of transfers when sending people to their deaths, of relocation when separating families, of medical selection when deciding who would live. That verbal distortion disoriented. Prisoners didn't know whether they were facing a punishment or a simple routine. Terror resided in ambiguity. It was never clear whether an order meant cleaning or execution. That constant doubt weakened the ability to react. New arrivals were subjected to symbolic rituals designed to erase all traces of their former identity. They had to repeat their number several times a day, memorize it in German, and respond only to it. They could not say their name. If they did, they were slapped. They were told they were no longer people, but parts of a system. Uniforms were the same, haircuts too. Voices were silenced and individual differences were punished. Homogenization was part of the process of dehumanization. The nights offered no rest. Those who tried to sleep were awakened with blows to form new lines, count the absent, or answer absurd questions. Some were forced to stand for hours while listening to shouting in German. Others were moved to different sections without explanation, only to return to the starting point. Insomnia was induced as an indirect punishment. Mental fatigue increased, the will unraveled. Testimonies agree on one point. Physical pain was bearable compared to psychological collapse. Watching a father forced to choose which of his children would be deported. Seeing a mother forced into silence while her daughter was taken. Witnessing a brother deny knowing his relative to avoid punishment. These scenes left no visible marks, but they destroyed every emotional bond. The camp did not just kill bodies, it destroyed relationships. Jewish prisoners were assigned tasks meant to destroy their faith and practices. Some were forced to trample on sacred books, clean toilets with religious objects, or work on key days of their spiritual calendar. The humiliation was not random, it targeted the soul. The punishment was aimed at eroding the cultural and spiritual dignity of each individual. The rupture with the past was induced daily. Fear was also fed by false hope. Transfers that never happened were promised, sentence reductions that were traps were announced, light jobs that ended in ambushes were offered. Trust in others' words was shattered. No one believed anyone. That breakdown of human bonds was part of the design. One who expected nothing was already dominated. That was the goal. Prisoners often experienced a kind of inner silence. After weeks of abuse, emotions shut down, sadness turned into apathy, rage into emptiness, the face became inert. Conversations were reduced to mechanical phrases. Some talked to themselves, others stopped responding. The disconnection from the world was progressive. Only the body remained in motion, but the mind was absent. The guards detected that final phase with precision. When someone stopped reacting, they used them as an example. They placed them at the center of the line, ridiculed them, pushed them. Sometimes they were left standing naked all night. That was the message. This is what happens when the will is lost. No one helped. Everyone looked down. The camp turned witnesses into forced accomplices. Every mechanism was designed to prevent collective resistance. Submission was not an option. It was the only possible outcome. Physical pain passed. Emotional damage remained. Many who survived could never speak. Others remembered only fragments. The invisible scars were permanent. Psychological torture was invisible to those who were not there. It left no blood, but it emptied from within. In Auschwitz, the crime was not only killing, it was erasing what made a person human. The mind was the target, and that crime left no evidence. The erased crime, the bodies, the pits, and Operation 1005. The mass graves in Auschwitz were not logistical errors. They were part of a system designed to function as a death factory, and later as a device for concealment. As the extermination machinery became more efficient, so did the accumulation of corpses. Rain would wash blood from the trenches. The smell of rotting flesh invaded the entire perimeter. It was impossible to ignore. Then came the urgency to erase the evidence. Thus began the final phase, the attempt to make the crime disappear. Starting in 1942, unprocessed bodies overwhelmed the cremation system. The overload forced the opening of large pits where hundreds of corpses were dumped. The Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to handle the bodies, were the ones who dug, dragged, and piled up human remains as if they were trash. Some witnesses claimed to have counted more than 2,000 corpses in a single pit, the piles of bodies mixed with mud, lime, and old ashes. On windy days, bone particles floated over the camp. In late 1942 and throughout 1943, a radical change occurred. Himmler and his advisors knew that defeat was beginning to loom in the East. The idea that one day there might be trials or investigations no longer seemed absurd. The Reich began to plan the physical disappearance of its crimes. Thus, Operation 1005 was born. This program had a single goal: eliminate all evidence of mass murder. Auschwitz, along with other camps, received clear instructions: exhume the pits, incinerate the bodies, and scatter the remains. The direct overseer of this operation was Paul Blobel, an SS officer with prior experience in mass killings in Ukraine. Blobel arrived in Auschwitz accompanied by experts in evidence destruction. The procedure was simple but brutal. The already buried corpses were removed, placed on improvised grills made of train rails, and ignited with gasoline. The flames reached several meters high. The smoke could be seen from kilometers away. Those living in nearby villages spoke of a permanent grey sky and ash in the wells. The Sonderkommando, under direct threat of execution, were responsible for exhuming, loading and feeding these pyres day and night. The fire never stopped. When they finished with one pit, they began another. Many worked with cloths tied around their faces to avoid vomiting. Some fainted from the heat, others collapsed from exhaustion. But they knew they couldn't stop. Anyone who did was replaced, and whoever was replaced ended up executed. The elimination system also included a crushing component. Bones that didn't fully burn were collected and ground with mallets or pressed with metal rollers. The ashes were then mixed with soil and spread across the fields. Sometimes they were dumped in rivers or artificial ponds. In some cases, entire train wagons filled with human remains were transported out of the complex for disposal. Every trace had to disappear. Not a tooth, not a vertebra, not a single mark was to remain intact. The operation also included dismantling crematoria that were damaged or too visible. Metal structures were taken apart, walls dynamited, and the rubble covered with grass to simulate abandonment. Ventilation ducts were sealed, blood drainage channels emptied, and spaces that had housed gas chambers were cemented over. Some areas were turned into farmland. Trees were even planted to hide the zones where bodies had been burned in the open. In 1944, with the advance of the Red Army, the destruction became more frantic. The SS increased cremation shifts and ordered the total extermination of the Sonderkommando, who knew the details of the process. On the 7th of October of that year, a group of these prisoners rebelled. They knew their execution was imminent. Using hidden explosives, they blew up one of the crematoria. Some escaped but were hunted down within hours. Most died in the attempt, but the rebellion left an indelible mark. The only witnesses to the destruction process had spoken with fire. Many details of Operation 1005 were later reconstructed thanks to testimonies from surviving prisoners, fragments of documents, and remains that had not been eliminated. In some pits excavated after the camp's liberation, the Soviets found fragments of skulls, human jaws with dental crowns, and charred bones embedded in the soil. Despite the Nazis' efforts to erase the crime, the physical traces were still there, trapped between layers of earth, grease, and bone dust. Estimates of how many bodies were cremated during this operation vary, but the number easily surpasses hundreds of thousands. Not all prisoners murdered in Auschwitz were taken to the ovens immediately. Many died from hunger, cold, beatings, or disease, and were buried in pits. Those bodies were also exhumed and reduced to ash. The erasure process was as systematic as the extermination itself, and as organized as any industrial phase of the regime. German reports indicate that, in the final months of operation, trucks carrying pulverized human remains were sent to various points across the Reich. The goal was to dilute the evidence across multiple areas, preventing the Allies from finding concentrated proof. Some fragments were thrown into swamps, others onto farmland. Human ashes were even used to reinforce interior roads of the complex, mixed with gravel. In parallel, administrative records were destroyed. Transport lists, medical reports, intake forms and deportation logs were burned. Any document linking names, dates or quantities was eliminated. Only a few papers managed to be hidden by members of the internal resistance. Those fragments proved crucial after the war in reconstructing part of the genocide. In Auschwitz's final days, the ovens operated at their limits. The SS used wood, coal, oil and body fat to accelerate incineration. Bodies were thrown in groups, without classification or respect. It no longer mattered whether they were men, women, children, the sick, or forced laborers. Everything had to disappear. It was the closing of a cycle: kill, burn, scatter, as if they had never existed. Operation 1005 in Auschwitz was the culmination of a perverse logic. First, a system was designed to kill, then one to hide the killing. Physical extermination was followed by the attempt to exterminate memory. Soldiers, officers, engineers, doctors, and forced prisoners all played a role in the chain of disappearance. Silence was part of the method. Witnesses were executed, infrastructure destroyed, the landscape altered, and yet testimonies survived, and bones survived. Tiny pieces of truth that escaped the fire, the acid, the excavator. Auschwitz tried to erase itself, and it failed. Auschwitz functioned as a system of destruction designed down to the smallest detail. Every part of the camp played a specific role in breaking bodies, nullifying minds, and making millions of lives disappear without allowing room for error. The structures, schedules, assigned roles and punishments followed an organized logic of continuous death. There was no improvisation, only efficiency. Torture took physical, medical, sexual and symbolic forms. The camp's machinery produced pain, obedience and disappearance as daily tasks. Nothing that occurred was spontaneous. Every crime was planned, executed and concealed by a hierarchical network that made Auschwitz the operational nucleus of extermination. The surviving evidence shows the operation of that factory of horror from its inception to its final dismantling.